Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the podcast today. This is the Tale of Two AIs podcast. And today I'm joined by Eric Siegel, CEO of Gooder AI, and he's one of the clearest voices in machine learning and predictive AI. Eric has been, just spending decades helping companies move machine learning from theory to real business impact. He's the author of best-selling books like Predictive AI and the AI Playbook. He is the founder of Machine Learning Week, a former professor at Columbia and Darden. He's a frequent speaker, has appeared on Bloomberg TV and radio, NPR Marketplace, etc. He's featured regularly in global publications such as Forbes, New York Times, Business Week. And Eric has advised enterprises for years on how to deploy machine learning models at scale, bridging the gap between advanced technology and business value in a way that few others can. So, Eric, great to have you on the podcast. Let's dive straight into the uncomfortable truth about data science. So let's talk about, something that you've said for years, that the hard part of machine learning isn't the models themselves. It's not about modeling, it's about deployment, it's about internal selling, it's about change management, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many different aspects of making machine learning really successful. Why does this still surprise practitioners and executives in 2026, you think?
Well, it surprises executives and practitioners because it surprises them. If it was sort of a known issue, it would be resolved and it wouldn't be there to surprise them.
Indeed.
Right?
Okay.
And the issue of which I speak is sort of a lack of focus on the business value in concrete terms, and specifically estimating the business value in monetary terms, typically like profit and savings, or whatever KPI happens to matter to the hospital or any organization. Before deployment, in order to understand what the deployment is meant to deliver, what the potential upside is from a business perspective, and be able to plan the deployment according to business value, and be able to sell the deployment. These projects usually don't deploy. That's the sad fact. So that's sort of the uncomfortable truth. But the good news is that we're close as an industry. So the crazy thing is what we're talking about here, enterprise machine learning models that are meant to predict who's going to click, buy, lie, or die, commit an act of fraud, or any outcome or behavior that's going to improve large-scale operations, right? That's also referred to, as you said a second ago, predictive AI. Just for clarity, right. The name of my first book is actually Predictive Analytics, but now that buzzword has pretty much changed to predictive AI, to contrast those types of use cases, those types of projects from generative AI. And so predictive AI is kind of older, but it's not old school. Most of its value is still largely untapped for the reasons I'm starting to allude to here. So the crazy thing is, this is the older technology. You'd think it has a lot more time, decades to mature.
Yeah.
But the good news is that although it hasn't quite reached this professionalization level of maturity, of having that business vantage and sort of a full holistic business side paradigm driving the project, it's close. We're close.
Yeah.
We only need one more mile out of a 10,000 mile journey. And it's sort of so close and yet so far. But in a nutshell, when the data scientist delivers the model and then they say the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve is 0.087, right, or 0.879 or whatever it is, it's usually between 0.8 and 0.9 or something. The executives and the decision makers, the person in charge of the operations meant to be improving the model, are like, what does that mean in terms of business? Well, how is that? What KPIs or monetary performance, savings, profit are going to be improved by what amount if I use your predictive model to actually integrate it, operationalize it, so that operations are hopefully done more efficiently. So translate it so that the project can be framed, can be planned according to those potential expected returns, financial returns usually, and that the planning of the deployment, the decisions about the deployment, exactly how to deploy,
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, and most often missing, the selling of the deployment. Because although the project as a whole has been greenlit, there's been investment of resources, and you as a data scientist's time has been invested in and spent to make the model. In fact, it turns out that does by no means necessarily mean that the project and the people are actually committed and have uh, made a promise to actually deploy the model. So the model still needs to be sold until it's going to be
Right.
operationalized. So you need to sell it in concrete terms of business value.
Yeah. And so what do you think is needed there? And that's some of the stuff that you're working on at Gooder, and you've been at it for some time now. Like, talk a little bit about what you're doing at Gooder, what the experience has been working on both sides of the equation, both the practitioners as well as the executives who are ultimately going to be using some of these models in production.
Yeah, and I've been a practitioner, data scientist, machine learning practitioner myself for more than 30 years. I co-founded Gooder AI. We founded the company 2.5 years ago because our understanding, our thesis is that the industry needs an off-the-shelf solution for this. That in general, if it's done at all, this idea of what we'll call machine learning valuation. So
Right.
evaluation, that's a standard step, right? And that's typically a technical metric like lift,
ROC or
yeah,
lift or yes,
ROCF
something.
score,
Yes.
area under the
Yeah.
curve, precision, recall, even accuracy,
Hmm.
just the technical metrics. And these numbers only tell you in a vacuum the relative performance, that it's better than guessing,
Right.
that it performs relatively well in comparison to some baseline like random guessing. And you can evaluate. They're very nice and tidy and comfortable for techies and for quants and data scientists, because
Right.
you can perform those calculations in a
It's
vacuum in
mathematical.
your
Yes.
yeah, in
Yeah.
your cubicle, and
Yeah.
they in a way where you're shielded from reality, because they have nothing to do with and do not depend at all on the business context in which the model will be used or how it'll be used in any way. They're just sort of these pure abstractions. So that's machine learning evaluation. More specifically, we need to move to also performing ML valuation. What's the business value? What are the metrics such as profit and savings or other KPIs that are going to measure it? But that is done unbelievably rarely. There's a lot of lip
Right.
service to it, and people tend to nod their heads. In fact, one industry survey I was involved in running ask data science what's the most important metrics, and they're like returns, money, profit, savings. And then you ask
Right.
what's the metrics you tend to use most frequently, and they just start listing like lift and area under the curve, the technical metrics. So the problem is that if you calculate it with a spreadsheet, which is the typical process, you still haven't solved the business problem, because when you make the
Yeah.
much needed fundamental move to also evaluating the model in terms of business value, then it hinges on certain business factors, certain business assumptions, factors that are subject to change and uncertainty. And because of that, it calls into question the validity of that estimation of how much money this model is going to make you. So to get the credibility that's absolutely needed, what you need is a very specialized interface to interact and try variations, literally physically move with sliders those types of business factors, such as false positive, false negative costs, or things that relate to that, so that when you move them, you see how it visually and intuitively changes the story, and you get that much needed human intuition about the degree to which those ranges of uncertainty and that kind of wiggle room actually
Yeah.
matters in terms of sussing out the business value of the model and the decisions about whether you should deploy, which model to deploy, and how to deploy it.
Absolutely. Makes sense. Makes sense. So, would love to hear how things go over the next, year or so, and how we can collaborate on that. But I'm curious, you talked about you just some of the challenges that data science teams see in being able to sell internally, and you've created this tool. But given your experience in this space, I mean, with so many changes going on, if you had to name the single biggest myth today about modern data science that's sort of holding teams back, what would that be?
Yeah, I think, well, the myth kind of goes along with the overall phenomenology that we're sort of alluding to with this uncomfortable truth. Like, it turns out these models usually don't deploy. There's sort of this ultimate gap between tech biz, which sort of hounds all different kinds of
Yeah.
technology. I would put it this way. The myth is that if you've created a sound model, it's probably going to get deployed. And if it doesn't get deployed, it's
Right.
not your fault. In fact, if it
Yeah.
doesn't get deployed, it's arguably at least somewhat, if not largely, your fault as a data scientist. Because
Right.
if you don't sell the model, nobody will. We need
Yeah.
to it has to become a common practice to actually sort of translate, to say, hey, look, this model not only is good technically, that it's sound in that respect, but it actually has potential to serve the organization, to serve the business,
Right.
to create this
Right.
business impact. So to put it another way, the goodness of a machine learning model isn't about technical performance. It's got to be about money or other KPIs that matter
Business
to the
value.
organization.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So the idea of, is this a good model, which seems like such an obvious
Yeah.
question that's got to be answered. It more broadly, it's like we still fetishize the core technology, right? To some
Right.
degree,
We're technologists. Right.
right. To some degree, I understand. That's why I got into the field in the first place. The idea of a computer to automatically
Yeah.
learn from some number of examples, draw generalizations that hold on new, unseen cases and new situations, novel, unique situations that have never before been encountered. That's amazing. It's amazing
It's magic.
technology. But
Yeah.
it's like we're more excited about the rocket science than the launch of the rocket,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's ironic, right? You don't see a lot of TV shows about the rocket scientists hard at work in the lab. What you see is the rocket
Right.
taking off, and for good reason. And we need to reorient the field of data science in the same way, and say, look, this isn't about how cool and amazing and awesome and neato this technology is. It's about how much value would this capacity to predict deliver if
Yeah.
only we were to systematically act on these predictions over many cases.
Yeah. Yeah. Love that analogy. Yeah. It's really all about getting the rocket launched and into the right place in space. Let's move to the one of the questions that I think pretty much everyone in the predictive AI space, and even I think some of the folks who are looking at this, treasure trove of data in the enterprise that's sitting in data warehouses and data lakes is thinking about. Like, what is Gen AI? Has Gen AI fixed anything fundamental in data science, or is it just, mostly shifted the attention away from the problems that are unsolved? I feel like in some ways, data science is sort of at pretty much the same place where we left it off in like maybe 2021, like 5 years ago. It somehow seems
Yeah.
a little bit fossilized. What do you think?
Yeah. For sure, because I think the answer to your question is both, right? So there's a degree to which Gen AI has taken away from typical predictive AI, data science, tabular data type projects, which are so vital. And again, most of the value is largely untapped. I mean, to sort of pitch that to the listeners out there, hey, which is more important, right? They should compete no more than a ski resort and a water park. But in reality, they very much do. They compete for resources, for data scientists, for attention, and for money and investments. So to a certain degree, Gen AI has kind of sucked the oxygen out of the room, where predictive AI, hey, we were just sort of getting started. We'd gone through a certain hype cycle, but we still weren't getting deployed with the systematic regularity that we very, very much have potential to achieve. And then that
Absolutely.
kind of got paused because there's so much attention to Gen AI. Now, Gen AI has its own value. It solves very different problems. And some of the problems that it
Right.
solves are within predictive AI projects. So Gen AI very much helps predictive AI. So that's why I said the answer is both. So although it's sort of perhaps taken a disproportionate amount of attention away, and it
Yeah.
shouldn't, right? The following statement is extremely subversive in the context of today's hype on Gen AI. And this is the statement: most organizations should probably invest at least as much in predictive AI. I mean, that's the technology you turn to improve existing large scale operations.
Right.
Having said all that, if anybody knows this, it's you, because of what FeatureByte does, which is, you're using Gen AI to very much help circumvent what had been an incredible bottleneck to preparing the data for predictive AI for enterprise machine learning projects. And that's one of several ways in which Gen AI very much helps. In the case of gooder AI, where most people, this idea of a profit curve, where if you contact more people according by targeting marketing, your profit
Yeah.
tends to go up and then it goes down. There's a sweet spot. If you, how many transactions should you audit? It goes up and down. There tends to be this Goldilocks zone, and being able to visualize that across what's essentially a factor of the decision threshold and then the y coordinates
Yeah.
money. This idea of a profit or savings curve, which is so rarely seen, is so fundamental and important. But because it's relatively new, both as stakeholders and then even to some data scientists, we put a chatbot on top of it with all the sort of specialized under the hood prompting related to exactly what our product allows you to do and what's being depicted on the screen. So you can ask, hey, can you explain this to a
Yeah.
kid? And then it tells a story about you're selling lemonade, you're running a lemonade stand and all that. It does a great job, right? So Gen AI helps explicate, it helps prep the data, it helps prep the modeling run. We've got a bunch about that. And in fact, I should probably take this. You and I haven't even ever discussed it this year, to my recollection. But I've been running the Machine Learning Week conference series since 2009, and we've changed the focus for this year. So May 5th through 6th in San Francisco, the name of the Machine Learning Week event is Hybrid AI 2026, focusing
Love it.
largely on
Yeah.
hybridizing between predictive and generative.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. I think there's so much focus that's needed on that particular topic because I think, quite frankly, enterprises are leaving a lot of money on the table by not investing enough in predictive AI because that's really where there's so much sort of
For sure.
embedded value in the data that needs to be extracted. And we're going to talk about, just what that means, the hybridization of AI, especially for enterprises, what that means architecturally as well as from a value perspective. But, before we go there, I want to talk a little bit about where you see predictive AI going, especially at this particular moment, because I shared this article with you in Fortune, from text to tables, then tabular data, structured data being AI's next $600 billion frontier. So, curious to get your viewpoint on what do you think is driving that, certain sort of almost a renaissance in predictive AI? Are we headed towards that renaissance, or is this, just a blip? Or yeah, well, what do you see in the future of predictive AI here?
Yeah, no, I think that we are going to be hitting a renaissance, and that's one of the reasons. So, I mean, that article, there's a recent article in Forbes about tabular foundation models, and I also wrote an article in Forbes about the same topic a year ago. But I called it something else, large database models. I think the industry's got a bunch of terms that they're trying to work out.
Right,
But the idea of doing something analogous to a large language model, but instead of learning over human language, learn over the other main source of human information and knowledge is in tabular data within enterprises, right? In
right,
addition to what large language models tap, which is human
yeah.
language,
And it's
across
all
the internet and
distilled
all the.
information. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So the potential to tap that and gain some level of analysis about the meaning of the content, the values and all that, how they interrelate, that does turn out to churn out prediction machines. Essentially, it makes it a lot more turnkey to do what we very much need for many of these enterprise use cases, which is prediction. And I quoted you in an article maybe a month or two ago on
yeah. A
Forbes
couple of months back. Yeah,
talking about the fact is these are going to remain they're both categories of use cases of machine learning, generative AI versus predictive AI. They both built on
right,
machine learning in the core, but they're very different levels of enterprise activities, and there's always going to be the need for predictive. Generative doesn't usurp it or take it over. It doesn't replace it. There's always going to be uncertainty. There's no magic crystal ball, and there's always going to be enterprise decisions, millions of them, that depend
yeah,
on, I hate to say the word, right, probabilities, right? So probabilities sounds boring, but
Statistics,
it's just
yes.
it's probabilities is a great thing. It's a number between 0 and 100 that tells you, relatively speaking, what the chance of this particular outcome for this particular case or this customer or transaction or whatever it is. That's a
Right,
great thing, and it's not a technical. It may take a lot of complex math to calculate it, but once you have it, it's just you've put it on a scale, and that's extremely valuable because what's the alternative? The alternative is having black and white thinking, of trying to
right.
be very confident it's either definitely going to happen or not. But since we have uncertainty and
Yeah,
that's not going away, and since we don't have magic crystal balls, we're going to need to put things on that scale. What are the chances of this outcome so that we can triage and prioritize them in terms of which individual transactions should be audited, who should be contacted, investigated, incarcerated, set up on a date, or medicated, right? So the need
love
for
it.
prediction not going away. So your
Yeah,
question was, is predictive AI, or those types of enterprise ML tabular use cases, whatever
yeah,
you want to call
yeah,
it, are they going to have a renaissance? And I
yeah.
made here a little list of reasons why I think it is going to have a
All
renaissance.
right.
If
Let's.
I find it, that's one of the main reasons. Oh yeah, here it is. But so one of the main reasons that's fueling it is the ability to do sort of analogous and highly advanced technical approaches, analogous to large language models, also to tabular
Right.
databases, right? So that area, tabular foundation models or large database models, whatever you want to call it. The other is that the bubble's going to burst, right? Now, I don't necessarily need to be too dismal or an alarmist, but I believe that you don't even need to look at the economics to make a firm bet that there's going to be some relatively extreme disillusionment in the foreseeable future, because you simply have to look at the difference between the promise and what's feasible. And the promise is
Right.
artificial humans. The promise is artificial general intelligence, the idea that a computer could do anything a person can do, right? Which is, by definition, supreme autonomy. Because the definition of autonomy is it does it on its own without the need for a human in the loop at all. You could hire this system just like a human employee and let it rip, right? Unleash it to operate on its own. I believe that that's the sort of ultimate and over promising as far as technology. It's almost like a ghost story. So I think that as seemingly human-like as large language models are, as incredible, unprecedented, and indeed very valuable in many ways, still we're going to only increasingly get clarity on the difference between what they can do and what humans can do. So the first reason is large
Yeah.
database models. The second is that some disillusionment's coming down the line. And then the third is what we've been referring to as this very prodigious hybrid between predictive and generative. And to be more specific, I believe the next killer app for predictive AI is going to be a reliability layer for generative AI, because generative AI suffers this horrible reliability problem. If you increase the scope of ambition for any particular project, let's say a customer service agent that's supposed to interact directly with end consumers and be completely automatic for a relatively large scope of potential tasks like changing
Yeah.
airline reservations or what have you, you very quickly, if you get beyond, like if you make the scope smaller where all it has to do is answer questions that would be encapsulated in a 20 question FAQ or 15
Right.
pages of written data, it can probably, it's amazing, right? It can probably do that well enough to be viable for large scale deployment. But if you just
Yeah.
increase the scope just a little bit, all of a sudden the kinds of mistakes that it can make, or if you now allow it to conduct transactions or work with data that should be heavily guarded, safeguarded, and protected as far as who gets access to it. All of those kinds of security concerns, behavior concerns, ethical concerns, it very, very quickly gets to a point where, well, maybe 5% of the time it does something
Yeah.
unacceptable. Now, 95% performance is incredible, unprecedented. We never could have believed it several years ago, but still, it's not viable for deployment.
Right.
How do we, that means the whole thing receives achieves, realizes zero value because it's not getting deployed. Here we have predictive AI to the rescue by scoring, putting a risk level a probability of a bad outcome on each interaction. And then
Yeah.
if you took
Yeah.
say the top 15% most high risk and funnel them off to that more expensive human in the loop to sort of
Right.
intervene or filter or what have you, the net result could be that there's only a 1% fault rate, which may
Yeah.
be low enough for some use cases to actually get the thing deployed. Now, all of a sudden,
Right.
no, we don't have a fully automatic system. We haven't achieved supreme autonomy, but we've achieved 85% of that generally audacious promise of Gen AI autonomy, right? Which is a lot better than none. And we've done it
Yeah.
because we put probabilities, we calculate probabilities, otherwise known as using predictive AI.
I love it. Yes. I'm 100% believer in what you described as the killer app, which is
And we
really a
have that. It's
combination of
really
predictive
starting
and
to,
Gen AI. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's really starting to emerge. I've been
Yeah.
seeking it out. We've got a whole bunch of use cases and people speaking at it on it at our conference in San Francisco, Machine Learning Week,
Yeah. Look
in
forward to it.
early May,
Yeah.
including IBM's chief data scientist, Salesforce, Hewlett Packard, healthcare examples, a full day workshop on it, OpenAI, Twilio,
Yeah.
Amazon, Netflix, Spotify, DoorDash, State Farm.
There you go. You're on to something. I mean, that's what we've been talking about all along, and I think it is, this the time has definitely come. Because
Yeah.
it's, at the end of the day, if these AI, LLMs and agents, if they need to build an intuition about the business, not just sort of parrot out, what the information that's available at the surface level, but if they truly need to understand Eric as a client and offer something that's meaningful to him or to someone else, they need to understand the customer, they need to understand the product, they need to understand the interaction between those products and customers in a much deeper level, at a much
Mhm.
deeper level. And that's not going to happen by just using past interactions. It's going to happen by actually examining purchase history.
Mhm.
Is going to happen through a combination of all of these different factors, and it just comes back to exactly what you stated. That is the killer app for enterprises. 100%.
It's interesting. It's almost as if you're talking about it as sort of there's qualitative analysis and quantitative. And Gen AI is sort of more in the qualitative camp. Although,
Yeah.
I don't know, that may be sort of an oversimplified way to stratify the
Well,
two.
yeah, from at least from an output and a human perspective, ultimately it's all math, but
Sure.
it's very probabilistic math,
Yeah, yeah,
and so
yeah.
you get non-deterministic results, right? I mean,
Yes, for
that's where
sure.
the difference lies. Yeah.
Yes.
But sorry, you were saying that it's qualitative versus quantitative,
Well,
and
I mean, Gen AI's forte is certainly not quantitative on a very deep or extensive
right,
level, right? I mean, it's made of machine learning. It's not made for machine learning, right?
right,
But you can give it machine learning capabilities or tools or hooks in place so it can make use of predictions that are output by a model, or it can make use of a machine learning library. It doesn't have to be the machine learning library, but it could use it.
right, right. Absolutely, absolutely. All right. Well, switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about just operationalizing data science, scalability, etc. And, you've worked with data science teams, especially enterprises across all kinds of different industries. What's the earliest signal that you think, you watch out for to see if a data scientist org will just fail to scale and they'll run into some kind of major bottlenecks?
Well, when you say scaled, are you referring to sort of how many projects they get done, or when? Because from in
Yeah,
my
it's
mind,
how
the
many
first
projects they
problem I
get
look
done,
for,
how much value they end up adding,
right, the value thing is whether it actually gets to deployment. So that's all. That's been my main focus for a good number of years at this point,
Yeah,
because it's so prevalent that it does not deploy. Right. I mean, what felt like sort of sniffing out baloney. And I've been running this conference series. It was originally called Predictive Analytics World since 2009.
I
So there's
remember.
been
Yes.
so many times that I see presentations and I'm like, wait a minute, in the end, it looks like maybe they didn't fully deploy. They kind of did a trial deployment, or didn't really reach production. So I started becoming more and more aware, and then you start hearing more and more anecdotal
Mm,
wisdom, and then we start getting more and more industrial research reports just showing just how flat out dismal the
yeah.
deployment rate is of predictive models developed with machine learning with the intention of actually being deployed. And the degree, and you get a sense, it's very indirect, of just how adept the industry has been at sweeping these failures under the rug. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? It's
Yeah.
an organizational issue. It's not a technical limitation. And the organizational issue is the thing that I noticed first with teams. And it's sort of the degree to which there is that disconnect between tech and biz. Are the
Mm,
stakeholders saying, oh, yeah, okay, let's do churn modeling, let's predict which customer is going to cancel their subscription. And then they just sort of hand it over to the data science team to do it by themselves in a vacuum. Whereas the only viable paradigm that for running these projects so that they actually successfully deploy with any, confidence and regularity
mm,
is to have a deep collaboration between tech and biz, so they're on the same page and talking the same language end to end across the project from conception to deployment, which includes the metrics, making sure we're assessing the value, the performance of the models in terms of business value. But it's more broad than that. And it's actually presented in my second book, which is called the AI Playbook. And the titular playbook paradigm framework I call BizML. It's a 6-step practice
mm.
for running the project and ensuring that you have this deep collaboration, which requires the business stakeholder to ramp up a bit. Not not a huge amount, but more than an hour's worth, basically a book's worth. And that's sort
Yeah.
of one of the purposes of my book, the AI Playbook.
I think it should be, you should start a course around this that every data scientist should go through, and even, the business stakeholders who are interacting on a daily basis with the data science teams. It's almost a reality, and I think that's one of the reasons why GenAI has just had this, just amazing adoption curve, because we all understand the output.
Mm.
It doesn't
Yeah,
take,
yeah,
some special understanding of statistics and probability to understand what the
for
outputs are
sure.
and see the results over time, right? But at the
I
same
mean,
time,
by
to your
definition,
earlier point, I think that getting to the point of disillusionment is going to happen fairly soon as well, because you can see exactly where some of these agents and LLMs are not working, or are not working really well.
not working well enough, is because very
Yeah.
quickly you get the ambition, the thing that they're intended to do, right? Ironically, they're by being more human-like, ironically, it turns out that makes them less potentially autonomous, because the kind of thing you want them to do
Very
is what
interesting.
people do,
Yeah.
versus what you do with predictive AI are things that are actually quite forgiving to error. You were getting them wrong most of the time anyway.
Right.
Now you're going to get them wrong less often. And which transactions should you block as a potentially fraudulent, and which customer should you contact for targeting marketing, and which machine should you investigate as potentially breaking down for predictive maintenance.
Yeah.
So the fact that large language models, by definition, are language, human language like English,
Yep.
which makes
Yep.
them both much, much easier to use and much more sexy. So they're easier to use because there's no training required. You just talk to them in English,
Right.
or your language.
This is amazing. Yes.
Right. So they're easier. That doesn't necessarily mean they're more valuable. So what's the exact business problem you're trying to solve? And if you want to
Yeah.
scale up to large scale operations, right, without the human in the loop, right, there's got to be a feasible, credible deployment. But at the same time, it lends itself to help because it's a lot more sexy, because it fits in with the narrative of AI that's been
Yeah.
cultivated now
Yeah.
for so many decades and across so many very enjoyable movies, I might say.
So that's that is super interesting, and I think something that you said, I will have to, we'll double click the next time around, which is, the more you try to make AI human like, the more you expose it to the kind of judgment that
Hmm.
humans reserve for others
Yeah, it's like
and
be
not
careful what you wish
typically
for.
machines. Yes.
Yeah.
So, fast forward 5 years, right? What does high functioning data science stack look like that most companies don't have today. Well, what do you think is how do you see the space kind of evolving in the next 2, 3, 5 years?
Well, I think they just need to add feature biting gooder AI to the
There
stack.
you go.
But with all seriousness, right? I mean, there's a huge bottleneck with data prep that's really very much taken for granted, and that's what you guys are taking on, and that's sort of the best of. I mean, it's a great example of where generative AI can add value because the task that you're doing is robust against the inevitable errors. I mean, if it was a human doing it, there'd be errors in that case as well, but it's a task that really needs the capabilities of generative AI. So that ability to go into the tables and the metadata and say, look, here's all the different, let's churn out a many different ways that we could create new features by combining other features in a way that makes sense
Yeah.
according to the meaning. Of course, it could get something wrong, but that's okay because all of this is then going to secondarily be subjected to the feature selection part, right? So that ends up being
Right.
sort of a
Right.
filter. So you explode it in a way that's fully automatic. So you're really leveraging Gen AI, but then you're exposing the limitations of, or you're eliminating the problems with Gen AI because you've got that filter, which is totally analogous, very closely analogous to what I'm referring to as a hybrid predictive
Yeah.
Gen AI, where predictive is the reliability layer. So, for example,
Right.
one firm, and they're going to be speaking at the conference, they do automatic coding health insurance claims. So that's
Mm.
like a labor intensive, but if you can look at the health insurance claim and automatically do the medical codes to try to get the insurance company to approve it,
Yeah.
then that's a Gen AI project. But then the predictive project is, okay, subsequently, which of these claims are at a high risk of getting denied by the insurance
Denied.
company?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's just a
Yeah.
binary predictive model. And by
Right.
doing that, you're filtering what was automatically done by the Gen AI system in the first place. Okay,
Very
so
interesting.
that's
Yeah.
on the sort of development of the model. But then when you're assessing the model, even during the iterative development, when you're planning which model to use and how to use it, and then actually trying to sell the deployment, that's where
Yeah.
gooder AI comes in, the what we call ML valuation. And again, I think the thing that's generally overlooked in the industry is the need to sell deployment because
Hmm.
it and without
That's what
that
consultants do
new
today. Yeah.
yeah, but they don't generally succeed. I mean, most of these models are still not getting deployed, and if you don't have a way to credibly estimate in a very concrete data driven way the
Hmm.
business upside, the business value that you could potentially get from the model, why would any sensible stakeholder actually greenlight it and authorize the deployment? In fact, they don't.
Right.
Most launches get scrubbed.
Yeah. It's easier to make a no decision than it is to put something in
Yeah.
production and face the consequences and the risk. So getting to the last question, Eric, I'm curious, based on all of this wisdom that you've gathered over time, if you could leave data science leaders and executives with one guiding principle for the next 2, 3, 5 years, what would that be?
I mean, if I was just going to hone it down to one, it would sort of be making that case that the concept of a predictive AI project is not going anywhere. It doesn't get replaced by generative. There is always going to be uncertainty. And when you're driving large scale operations, millions of micro decisions, they depend on outcomes that are subject to uncertainty. So we need to go back to probabilities.
Awesome. And yes, it's the probabilistic context that Gen AI will need in order to make the right decisions. Love it.
Yeah,
Eric,
exactly.
thanks so much. It's
Yeah,
great to
Razi,
have you today. It's
thanks
been
for
an
having me.
amazing
Yeah,
conversation. Yeah, this is melding of minds. So looking forward
awesome.
to how this comes out and looking forward to our collaboration.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Razi.